Hello there, William Golding again. We're going to be moving on to chapter 3 at this point. Your essential question should be, how would you describe the conflict between Ralph and Jack? Now again, we talked quite a bit last chapter about how Jack and Ralph have this conflict over authority, who's in charge. That led to a pretty extreme argument at the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3, Huts on a Beach. Jack was bent double. He was down like a sprinter. His nose was only a few inches away from the humid earth. The tree trunks and the creepers that festooned them lost themselves in a green dusk 30 feet above him, and all about was the undergrowth. There was only the faintest indication of a trail here, a cracked twig, and what might be the impression of one side of a hoof. He lowered his chin and stared at these traces as though he would force them to speak to him. Then, dog-like, uncomfortably on all fours, yet unheeding in his discomfort, he stole forward 5 yards, and he stopped. Here was a loop of creeper with a tendril pendant from a node. The tendril was polished on the underside. Pigs, passing through this loop, brushed it with their bristly hide. So I want you to pay attention to how I opened this chapter. A little update about this particular chapter. It's my intention to put the timeline a few months after the fire on the mountain, that Jack is doing these things. He's hunting for a pig, and he has been practicing this for a long time, weeks, perhaps months even, perfecting his craft in order to make his first kill. Jack crouched with his face a few inches away from this clue, then stared forward into the semi-darkness of the undergrowth. His handy hair, considerably longer than it had been when he had dropped in, was lighter now, and his bare back was a mass of dark freckles and peeling sunburn. A sharpened stick about 5 feet long trailed from his right hand, and except for a pair of tattered shorts held up by his knife belt, he was naked. He closed his eyes, raised his head, and breathed in gently with flared nostrils, assessing the current of warm air for information. The forest and he were very still. At length he let out his breath in a long sigh and opened his eyes. They were bright blue, eyes that in this frustration seemed to be bolting and nearly mad. He passed his tongue across his dry lips and scanned the uncommunicative forest. Then again he stole forward and cast this way and that over the ground. The silence of the forest was more oppressive than the heat, and at this hour of the day there was not even a whine of insects. Only when Jack himself roused a gaudy bird from his primitive nest of sticks was the silence shattered, an echo set ringing by a harsh cry that seemed to come out of the abyss of ages. Jack himself shrank at this cry with a hiss of indrawn breath, and for a minute he became less of a hunter than a furtive thing, ape-like among the tangle of trees. So what I'm attempting to do here with this particular description is to show the dehumanization of Jack. He's no longer a person. He's no longer a human being. He's no longer a hunter, but he is very animal-like. Then the trail. The frustration claimed him again, and he searched the ground avidly. By the trunk of a vast tree grew pale flowers on its grey bark, and he checked, closed his eyes, and once more drew in the warm air, and this time his breath came short. There was even a passing pallor in his face, and then the surge of blood again, and he passed like a shadow under the darkness of the tree and crouched, looking down at the trodden ground at his feet. The droppings were warm. They lay piled among the turned earth. They were olive green and smooth, and they steamed a little. Jack lifted his head and stared at these inscrutable masses of creeper that lay across the trail. And then he raised his spear, and he sneaked forward. Beyond the creeper, the trail joined a pig run that was wide enough and trodden enough to be a path. The ground was hardened by an accustomed tread, and as Jack rose to his full height, he heard something moving in it. He swung back his right arm, and he hurled his spear with all his strength. From the pig run came quick, hard patter of hooves and a castanet sound, very seducing, maddening, the promise of meat. He rushed out of the undergrowth and snatched up his spear. The pattering of the pig's trotters died away in the distance. Jack stood there, steaming with sweat, streaked down with brown earth, stained by all the vicissitudes of the day's hunting. Swearing, he turned off the trail and pushed his way through until the forest opened, and instead of bold trunks supporting a dark roof, there were light gray trunks and crowns of feathery palm. Beyond these was the glitter of the sea, and he could hear voices. Ralph was standing by a contraption of palm trunks and leaves. A rude shelter that had faced the lagoon seemed very near to falling down. He did not notice when Jack spoke. "Got any water?" Ralph looked up, frowning from the complication of leaves. He did not notice Jack even when he saw him. "I said, have you got any water? I'm thirsty." Ralph withdrew his attention from the shelter and realized Jack with a start. "Oh, hello. Water? There by the tree. Ought to be some left." Jack took up a coconut shell that brimmed with fresh water from among a group that was arranged in the shade, and he drank. The water splashed over his chin and neck and chest. He breathed noisily when he had finished. "Needed that?" Simon spoke from inside the shelter. "Up a bit." Ralph turned to the shelter and lifted a branch with a whole tiling of leaves. The leaves came apart and fluttered down. Simon's contrite face appeared in the hole. "Sorry!" Ralph surveyed the wreck with distaste. Never get it done. He flung himself down at Jack's feet. Simon remained looking at the hole in the shelter, and once down, Ralph explained. "Been working on it for days now. And look!" 2 shelters were in position, but shaky. This one was a ruin. "And they keep running off. You remember the meeting? How everyone was going to work hard until the shelters were finished?" "Except for me and my hunters." "Except the hunters. Well, the Letlands are..." He gesticulated. He sought for a word. "Well, they're hopeless. The older ones aren't much better. D'you see? All day I've been working with Simon, no one else. And they're off bathing or eating or playing." Simon poked out his head carefully. "Well, you're the chief. You tell 'em off." Ralph lay flat and looked up at the palm trees in the sky. "Meetings. Don't we love meetings? Every day, twice a day, we talk." He got on one elbow. "I bet if I blew the conch this minute, they'd come running, and then, we'd be very solemn, and someone would say we ought to build a jet or a submarine or a TV set. And when the meeting was over, they wept for 5 minutes and then wander off or go hunting." Jack flushed. "We want meat." "Well, we haven't got any yet. And we want shelters. Besides, the rest of your hunters came back hours ago. They've been swimming. Well, I went on, said Jack. I let them go. I had to go on. He tried to convey this compulsion to track down and kill that was swallowing him up. I went on. I thought by myself. The madness into his eyes came again. I thought I might kill. But you didn't. I thought I might. Some hidden passion vibrated in Ralph's voice. But you haven't yet! His invitation might have passed as casual, were it not for its undertone. You wouldn't care to help with the shelters, I suppose? Well, we want meat. And we don't get it. And now the antagonism was audible. But I shall. Next time, I got to get a barb on this spear. We wounded a pig and the spear fell out. If we could only make barbs. We need shelters. Suddenly Jack shouted in rage. Are you accusing? All I'm saying is I've worked dashed hard, that's all. Okay, I want to stop here for a second. I want to ask you a question. When you think about married couples, or maybe even your parents, what is it that they argue about the most? Do they argue about money? Do they argue about who does what? Do they argue about the sharing of labor in the home? So what is this conflict about between Ralph and Jack? Is it just about who's doing what? Is it about someone working harder than someone else? Or is it that someone is disappointed with their station, their position on the island? Maybe Ralph is disappointed. Maybe he didn't want to be the leader. It's kind of interesting. Think about that. They were both red in the face and found looking at each other difficult. Ralph rolled on his stomach and he began to play with the grass. If it rains in here like we dropped in, we'll need shelters all right. And then another thing. We need shelters because of the... Pause for a moment, and they both pushed their anger away. And then he went on with the safe, changed subject. You've noticed, haven't you? Jack put down his spear and squatted. Noticed what? Well, they're frightened. He rolled over and peered into Jack's fierce, dirty face. I mean the way things are. They dream. You can hear 'em. Have you been awake at night? Jack shook his head. They talk and scream. The Litlins. Even some of the others, as if this wasn't a good island. Now I want you to notice who I had say this. Simon says this, as if it wasn't a good island. Astonished at this interruption, they looked at Simon's serious face. As if, said Simon, the beastie or the snake thing was real. Remember? Please, get this quote down into your notes. We're going to talk a little bit more about Simon as this chapter continues, but this is an important facet of Simon's personality. He empathizes. Empathy is this idea that you can feel other people's feelings, that when someone else suffers or someone else is in pain, you actually feel that pain, that suffering. And Simon is feeling that from the Litlins, and we're going to see more of that as we read on in this chapter. The two older boys flinched when they heard this shameful syllable. Snakes were not mentioned now. They were not mentionable. As if this wasn't a good island, said Ralph slowly. Yes, that's right. Jack sat up and stretched out his legs. Well, they're batty. Crackers, remember when we went exploring? They grinned at each other, remembering that glamour of that first day, and Ralph went on. So we need shelters as sort of a home. That's right. Jack drew up his legs, clasped his knees, and frowned in an effort to attain clarity. All the same, in the forest. I mean when you're hunting, not when you're getting fruit. Of course. But when you're on your own. He paused for a moment, not sure if Ralph would take him seriously. Well, go on. If you're hunting sometimes, you catch yourself feeling as if... He flushed suddenly. No, there's nothing in it, of course. Just a feeling. But you can feel as if you're not hunting, but being hunted. As if something's behind you, all the time in the jungle. They were silent again. Simon intent, Ralph incredulous and faintly indignant, sat up, rubbing one shoulder with a dirty hand. Well, I don't know. Jack leapt up onto his feet and he spoke very quickly. Well, that's how you can feel in the forest. Of course there's nothing in it. Only... He took a few rapid steps toward the beach and then came back. Only I know how they feel. See? That's all. Well, the best thing that we can do is get ourselves rescued. Jack had to think for a moment before he could remember what rescued was. Rescue? Oh, yes, of course. All the same, I'd like to catch a pig first. He snatched up his spear and dashed it into the ground. The opaque, mad look came into his eyes again. Ralph looked at him critically through his tangle of hair. So long as your hunters remember the fire. You and your fire. The boys trotted down the beach and, turning at the water's edge, looked back at the pink mountain. The trickle of smoke sketched a chalky line up the solid blue sky, wavering high up and faded, and Ralph frowned. I wonder how far you could see that. Miles. We don't make enough smoke. The bottom part trickled as though conscious of their gaze, thickened to a creamy blur which crept up the feeble column. They put green branches on, muttered Ralph. I wonder! He screwed up his eyes and swung round to search the horizon. Got it! Jack shouted so loudly that Ralph jumped. What? Where? Is there a ship? But Jack was pointing to the high declivities that led down from the mountain to the flatter part of the island. Of course! They'll lie up there! They must! When the sun's too hot! Ralph gazed bewildered at his rat face. They get up high! High up in the shade, resting during the heat, like cows at home. I thought you saw a ship! We could steal up on one, paint our faces so they wouldn't see, perhaps surround them, and then... Indignation took Ralph's control. I was talking about the smoke! Don't you want to be rescued? All you can talk about is pig, pig, pig! But we want meat! And I work all day with nothing but Simon, and you come back and you don't even notice the huts! Well, I was working too! But you like it! Shouted Ralph. You want to hunt while I... And they faced each other on the bright beach, astonished by this rub of feeling. Ralph looked away at first, pretending interest in a group of litlins on the sand. From beyond the platform came shouting of the hunters in the swimming pool, and on the end of the platform Piggy was laying flat, looking down into the brilliant water. People don't help much. wanted to explain how people were never quite what you thought they were. Well, Simon, he helps. He pointed to the shelters. All the rest rushed off, and he's done as much as I have, only Simon's always about. Ralph stared back to the shelters with Jack by his side. I'll do a bit for you, muttered Jack, before I have to bathe. Oh, don't bother. But when they reached the shelters, Simon was not to be seen. Ralph put his head in the hole, withdrew it, and turned to Jack. He's buzzed off. Got fed up, said Jack, and gone for a bath. Ralph frowned. He's queer. He's funny. Jack nodded, as much as sake of agreeing than anything, and by tacit consent they left the shelter and went toward the bathing pool. And then, said Jack, when I've had a bathe and something to eat, I'll just trek over to the other side of the mountain and see if I can see any traces. Coming? But the sun's nearly set. I might have time. And they walked along, 2 continents of experience and feeling unable to communicate. If only I could get a pig. Well, I'll come back and go on with the shelter. And they looked at each other, baffled, in love and hate. All the warm salt water of the bathing pool and shouting and splashing and laughing were only just sufficient to bring them together again. So at this point, you should be able to answer the essential question. The chapter is not concluded. We're going to take a closer look at Simon's experience on the island, and there is going to be some clues, some foreshadowing to events that are to occur later on in the story. So I want you to take some good notes about what Simon does in this chapter. We're going to need to be able to explain Simon's personality as the novel continues. Simon was not in the bathing pool as they expected. When the other 2 had trotted down to the beach to look back at the mountain, he had followed them for a few yards and then he stopped. He had stood frowning down at a pile of sand on the beach where somebody had been trying to build a little house or a hut. And then he turned his back on this and he walked into the forest with an air of purpose. He was a small, skinny boy. His chin was pointed and his eyes were so bright they had deceived Ralph into thinking him delightfully gay and wicked. The coarse mop of his black hair was long and swung down. I need to explain that in the movie, Simon's hair is very blonde, almost white colored. In the book that I wrote, Simon's hair is black. So just making sure you don't have that confusion. He wore the remains of shorts and his feet were bare like Jack's. Always darkish in color, Simon was burned by the sun to a deep tan that glistened with sweat. He picked his way up the scar, past a great rock where Ralph had climbed on the first morning, and then he turned off to his right among the trees. He walked with an unaccustomed tread through the acres of fruit, where the least energetic could find an easy if not unsatisfying meal. Flower and fruit grew together on the same tree, and everywhere was the scent of ripeness and the blooming of a million bees at pasture. Here the litlins who had run after him caught up with him. They talked, cried out unintelligibly, lugged him toward the trees. Then, amid the roar of bees in the afternoon sunlight, Simon found them the fruit that they could not reach, and he pulled off the choicest from the foliage, passed them down to the endless outstretched hands. And when he had satisfied them, he paused and looked round. The litlins watched him inscrutably over double handfuls of ripe fruit. So I want you to notice that part of Simon's personality here is that he takes the time to help the litlins get the fruit off the trees that they can't reach. Simon turned away from them and went where the just perceptible path led him. Soon the high jungle closed in. Tall trunks bore unexpected pale flowers all the way up the dark canopy where life went on clamorously. The air here was dark too, and the creepers dropped their ropes like the rigging of foundered ships. His feet left prints in the soft soil, and the creepers shivered throughout their lengths when he bumped them. He came at last to a place where more sunshine fell, and since they had not so far to go for the light, the creepers had woven a great mat that hung at the side of an open space in the jungle. So picture these creepers growing together in a mat or in a shelter-like situation. The whole space was walled with dark aromatic bushes and a bowl of heat and light. A great tree, fallen across one corner, leaned against the trees that stood still, and the rapid climber flaunted red and yellow sprays right to the top. So picture this place with this mat or this shelter, this natural shelter that's formed by these creepers and these beautiful red and yellow flowers blooming in this part of the rainforest. Simon paused. He looked over his shoulder, as Jack had done, at the close ways behind him, and glanced swiftly round to confirm that he was utterly alone. For a moment his movements were almost furtive, and then he bent down and wormed his way into the center of this mat. The creepers and the bushes were so close that he left his sweat on them, and he pulled together behind them. Okay, so picture Simon sitting in the middle of this mat, the middle of this natural shelter. We're going to refer to this as Simon's cabin. And he spends each and every night in this cabin, sleeping by himself in the middle of the forest. When he was secure in the middle of this, he was in his little cabin, screened off from the open space by a few leaves. He squatted down, parted the leaves, and looked out into the clearing. So picture Simon looking through the mat to see what's out there. He can't be seen, but he can see everything out there. Nothing moved but a pair of gaudy butterflies and danced round each other in the hot air. Holding his breath, he cocked a critical ear at the sounds of the island. Evening was advancing toward the island, and the sound of bright, fantastic birds, the bee sounds, even the crying of the gulls that were returning to their roost among the square rocks were fainter. The deep sea breaking miles away on the reef made an undertone less perceptible than the cessation of his blood, and Simon dropped the screen of leaves back into its place. And then the slope of the bars of honey-colored sunlight decreased, and they slid up the bushes and passed over the green candle-like buds, moving up toward the canopy, and the darkness thickened under the trees. With the fading of the light, the riotous colors died, and the heat and the urgency cooled away, and then the candle buds stirred. So picture these little buds on these vines, that when the sun goes down and the moon comes up, they open at night. The green sepals drew back a little, and the white tips of the flowers rose delicately to meet the open air. And now the sunlight had lifted clear of the open space and withdrawn from the sky. Darkness poured out, submerging the ways between the trees until they were dim, strange as the bottom of the sea. The candlebuds opened their wide white flowers, glimmering under the light, and pricked down from the first of the stars. Their scent spilled out into the air and took possession of the island. So picture again Simon sleeping in his little cabin every night under these beautiful white flowers that open up at night, and their scent spills out. And he smells these beautiful smells, and he hears the waves crashing on the reef out in the sea miles away. And this beautiful scent and this beautiful noise and this beautiful place that Simon has found for himself allows him to sleep restfully. Thank you for reading chapter 3 today. Look forward to chapter 4, which is going to increase the conflict quite a bit.